Okay, hello. Welcome everybody to this webinar, Who on Earth Wants a World Government? We are here with Dr. Farsan Ghassim. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Ghassim?
Farsan Ghassim is fine enough. I don't want
Okay.
to I don't want to make you pronounce it the Persian way that it's supposed to be pronounced.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yes, he's a junior research fellow in politics at the Queen's College at the University of Oxford. My name is Eston McKegg, and I'm the president of the Young World Federalists. We are a global movement dedicated to building support for world federalism. And Dr. Farsan, along with Dr. Markus Pauli, have written an exciting study called Who on Earth Wants a World Government, which is where we stole the title for this webinar from. Who on Earth Wants a World Government? What kind and why? An international survey experiment. It was published this year in International Studies Quarterly. And in this study, they surveyed over 42,000 citizens in 17 countries across the globe and their preferences towards quote unquote world government. This rather outstanding research showed significant international support for foundational transformations of global governance. And this study was brought to my attention by some dedicated volunteers here at the Young World Federalists, and they found it very interesting, of course, because we were always searching for any sort of evidence, academic or otherwise, that sort of backs up our belief in a democratic world federation and the necessity for it. And of course, a study like this, which shows that not only is stronger global governance necessary, but actually wanted by a large amount of the global population, obviously piqued our interest and was in the inspiration behind inviting you here to present the research and do a little bit of a Q&A afterwards. So that's my introduction. I'll just turn it over to you, Farsan, if you'd like to take it from there.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation, Eston. Again, it's a pleasure to present to you guys today. I've worked with the World Federalist Movement and Democracy Without Borders, as some in the room know. I saw John is there as well. So it's a real pleasure to present to you guys today. I think maybe I just get started with the paper right away. If I understand, I have about 30 minutes, right? So that's quite an extensive time to cover the paper, I think. I'll try to cover it in a way, if you've read it before, to give you some additional insights, but also if you haven't had a chance to read it in detail, I think the presentation is quite comprehensive in kind of the coverage of the paper. And then obviously we can go into detail in the Q&A, not just on the paper itself, but also, obviously how it relates to your work. So shall I get started then, Eston, or?
Yes, that sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So the paper, first off, maybe just to give you a bit of background of when we started this paper. You'll see it in the later on in the presentation as well. Markus and I, we met back in 2017 when we started working on this. My work on this goes back quite a bit further. I've worked with, like I said, Democracy Without Borders, or the campaign for a UN Parliament before. So full disclosure, on my kind of personal engagement in that, but still, the project itself is very much an empirical one, right? It's not in any way, I think, not in any way kind of biased or influenced by our personal views on this matter. It's purely an empirical question about public opinion, and we build on. You'll see that in a bit as well. We build on kind of best practices in survey research to make the questions non-leading, unbiased, and we're somewhat surprised, to be honest, by the findings. Okay, so without further ado, let me delve into it. So the background, obviously, for the paper is the world government debate that you obviously know very well. The people in this room, I don't need to delve too much into it. There's, I guess you can broadly say, the two sides of that debate. You can distinguish between advocates and critics. On the advocate side, it's an age-old debate going back to people like Dante Alighieri, Immanuel Kant. spanning the world, with people like Nehru, Krumah, and going back decades with people like Schwimmer, Yukawa, listed well by our colleagues Gilad and Friedman in their 2022 piece, book on global democracy. Obviously, a high point in the movement was the post-World War II advocacy for a world government with a focus on nuclear security, where the likes of Einstein, Russell, Albert Camus advocated the idea of a world government. And then the post-Cold War phase saw kind of a revival of this debate, right? Now framed in different ways in terms of cosmopolitan democracy or global democracy rather than world government, but still in many ways building on the same ideas of strong democratic global institutions, separation of powers, the principle of subsidiarity, et cetera, et cetera. And then obviously there's more instrumental versions of the idea of a world government as well, proposed by the likes of Daniel Dudney, or framed in terms of global justice by the likes of Luis Cabrera, Thomas Pogge, etc. Then of course there's the side of the critics. Similarly, prominent authors in the past and present are more on the critic side of the world government debate. Hannah Arendt, David Miller, Reinhard Niebuhr, Rawls, Shapiro. And they've put forth various arguments against the idea of global government. One prominent one is that of a global tyranny, that such an institution would inevitably kind of digress into a tyranny on the global scale, that a world government or integration at the global level to that extent would inevitably lead to cultural homogenization. And stagnation as well, in the sense that competing polities are a necessary requirement for progress, arguably, those critics would argue, and therefore political integration at the global level would lead to somewhat stagnation in economic, cultural senses, etc. Most of these arguments, notably, are targeted at an unspecified version of world government. So in other words, the object that they criticize is not specified in any significant ways as federal, democratic, or based on the subsidiarity principle, outlining certain issue areas that it would focus on, etc. And what's also notable is that, at least in my reading of these arguments, is that many of those who call for or who on paper oppose a world government end up proposing something that's quite similar to what we would call a world government. So Simon Caney, David Held, Immanuel Kant, Martha Nussbaum, and Thomas Pogge are just some of the examples here of people who on paper in some ways have opposed the world government, but then end up proposing something very, very similar. Cosmopolitan democracy in the case of David Held, or vertical dispersal of sovereignty in the case of Thomas Pogge. So the debate, bottom line, has been primarily normative, but it's also featured some empirical claims. One of these empirical claims is that a world government would not be feasible, or global democracy would not be feasible. Matthias Koenig-Archibugi at LSE has tackled that question in a 2011 paper that I highly recommend. It was published in the European Journal of International Relations, and it's called "Is Global Democracy Possible?" And he concludes that it is unlikely, but not impossible. He does that, and he approaches that question empirically by studying real-world democracies as they exist, and using a empirical technique called qualitative component analysis to analyze which of these criteria that have been claimed to be essential for democracy are actually essential, have actually turned out to be necessary ingredients. Then again, Matthias, together with Thomas Hale here in Oxford, in a 2019 paper in the Journal of Politics, they addressed the question, or the claim, that the world is too diverse for something like a global democracy or a world government to form. So what they did is they looked at the world as a whole as a potential world polity, and examined survey data from around the world to see how it compares to other existing polities, and specifically democratic polities around the world. And what they find is that in many ways, the world as a whole is more like an average country in terms of policy diversity, issue view diversity, that countries such as the United States is still functioning democracy, even though it obviously has severe issues as we're witnessing. But it is a functioning democracy, and it's much more diverse in terms of views along different measures of a diversity than an average than the world as a whole is. So in some ways, if you want to look at the world as a whole, it would be shaped somehow like this in terms of diversity of views on global issues, whereas somewhere like the US would be shaped more like this, bimodal, as it's called in statistics, versus normally distributed. Okay, so these are two very good pieces on kind of the empirical debate about relating to world government. What we then picked as our research gap is the argument that often recurs about people not wanting it. So the claim is people would not want something such as a world government. But usually when that claim is made, there's no empirical evidence that's provided for or against it. So that's what we set out to do. Let's gather empirical evidence to assess the claim that the majority of the global population does not support the establishment of a world government. The claim is widespread, but it's unsubstantiated, we argue, and it's made by both advocates and critics. So for example, David Miller, a critic here in Oxford, has said in a 2010 piece, it is doubtful whether the stronger forms of global democracy, such as a global assembly with legislative powers, would be regarded as legitimate in a materially and culturally diverse world. Juncker, an advocate of global government, has argued, quote, conscious or unconscious identification of world government as a form of imperial government is an important reason why the idea of a world government is currently rejected by large populations, a large majority of the world population, quote end. So both advocates and critics have made this empirical claim without providing any evidence. So it's an important assumption in arguing for world government's infeasibility, but also its undesirability, right? So for Juncker, for example, the fact or the claim that world government is supposedly rejected by large majorities makes it infeasible, even though he finds it desirable. For someone like Miller, the fact that, or the claim that majorities allegedly oppose world government makes it undesirable. But both of them are based obviously on the fundamental assumption that people, in fact, majorities, in fact, around the world oppose global governments. But is this assumption valid? That's the question that we asked. And specifically, we broke it down into four kind of research questions building on each other. The first one, simply, do people worldwide indeed reject the proposal of an unspecified world government? In a previous version, we called that the specter of world government. Then building on that, would people support for a world government increase if it is specified in institutional and or functional ways, as contemporary advocates do, as we saw earlier? Then building on that, do majorities of people worldwide indeed support a world government when specified in institutional and functional ways? And to what extent can we explain public opinion through factors such as population size, regime type, economic wealth, geopolitical power? Okay, so any questions about this kind of first part? Otherwise, I would continue with kind of the theoretical backdrop. But I guess we have Eston plenty of time afterwards, right? So maybe.
Yeah, I mean, if we have any clarifying questions, if somebody didn't understand anything, I think we could open the floor briefly to something like a clarifying question, but any sort of broader discussion sort of thing, I would say for the Q&A. And I don't see anything, so I think we can just move on.
Great. Right. Okay. So then, kind of the conceptual backdrop for the paper is this separation of the concept of global government into different variations as they've been specified. So the unspecified version is very much kind of the straw man that's been used in the by critics of world government. So simply the phrase world government and stating their reasons for objection to it. Then there's this institutional specification, mostly as democratic, right, by the likes of David Held, Daniele Archibugi, etc., who've been arguing for a global government in a specified democratically for procedural reasons, arguing that basically because transnational issues are beyond the control of democratic polities in the present day. We need democratic institutions at the global level to address such issues. And then the functional specification, focusing on specific issues. For someone like Dan Dudney, that would be nuclear security, right? But then there's issues such as poverty, which is the kind of central focus for someone like Luis Cabrera or Thomas Pogge. Climate is a focus of the likes of Simon Caney. Security, as I just said, Dan Dudney. And then we also took the opportunity during the COVID pandemic to include COVID as a case in point for potential functional specification of a global government. And then there's the post specification, as we call it. So combining institutional and functional elements. So a global government that would be both democratic and focused on on global issues, whereas lower levels at the regional, at the national level of governance would still be in charge of sub-global issues. And then we broke that down into a set of different hypotheses, which we can, let me go over them briefly. So the first one, majorities of people would reject the proposal of an unspecified world government. We hypothesized that basically, based on these widespread claims, but among both critics and supporters of a world government, that most people would reject such an unspecified version. But then we also thought that, partly based on surveys kind of touching on similar issues that were out there, that people would be more likely to support it if it was specified as democratic, as focused on global issues, as focused on issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And also, obviously, when these two specifications are combined. So that's what you see in H5 and H6, that people would be more likely to support it when it is specified as democratic and focused on global issues, or democratic and focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. And then moving on to majority opinion. So we also suspected that indeed majorities would be supportive of these combinations of functional and institutional specifications. And then another set of hypotheses focused on the factors that would drive world government support, specifically at the country level. But here we didn't have any strong reasons to suspect one way or the other, and also didn't pre-register these hypotheses before we conducted the experiments. So basically, these hypotheses go in both directions. There are good reasons to believe that more populous countries, citizens of more populous countries, would be more supportive of a world government, but also of less populous countries. So, for example, in more populous countries, people might think that a world government would give them even more influence, whereas citizens of less populous countries may want a world government, may be more likely to support a world government because they would think that such a transformation of the global governance system would give their country, their people, a bigger voice in such a reformed global governance system. Then hypothesis 10, again, it could go in both directions. 10A and 10B would say that people of wealthier countries might support a world government more because they would think that such an integrated global governance system would allow them more influence, whereas people of poorer countries might be more supportive if they believe that such a transformation of global governance could overcome the disparities of the present-day system. Same with the criteria of democratic characteristics and power. So people in more democratic countries might believe that a democratic world government specifically would kind of ingrain their values of democracy at the global level, whereas people in less democratic countries may think that a democratic world government specifically might give them the privileges that they've been deprived of at the national level. And then finally, the criterion of power. There's again kind of a hope of, could be a hope of citizens in more powerful countries that their position of power would be even more pronounced in a potential world government, whereas people in less powerful countries may hope that actually power disparities could be overcome through the formation of a world government. So again, there are reasons in both directions, and we didn't have any strong priors there on what on how the direction would pan out in practice. Okay, so that's the theoretical backdrop of the paper. Let me now just delve briefly in a couple of slides into the research design, and then and also, you know, bearing in mind obviously that maybe some in the audience are not familiar with the kinds of experimental survey methodology that we used. So very briefly, what we do in survey experiments generally in political science and other social sciences and also in natural sciences is to randomly allocate respondents to control and treatment groups. And then basically the difference between these two groups is only one aspect by design, right? So in this case, as you'll see on the next slide, it's the question that we ask them about world government. And then what you can do is you can compare the difference in means between the responses of the two groups and attribute that difference solely to the treatment, because these two groups otherwise are equal. So, and just to be clear, we're not obviously claiming that one person, we use a silly comparison there at the bottom left, that this person is equal to this other person. We're not saying that, right? We don't have clones of people that we can randomize into different groups. What we're saying is that this group of people, again at the bottom left, is about equivalent on average to this other group of people, as long as we're completely randomizing people into the control and the treatment groups. And the evidence for that is the case, you see on the right side. So that's the data that we from our experiment. And what you see there is that the average age in both groups, in the control and the treatment groups, was around 51, right? The average gender, so, you know, depending on how you code the genders, obviously, was about 1.5. Educational attainment average was about 12, and so on. And the p-values in the last column show you that these differences are indeed not statistically significant. So in other words, any differences that are there between these two groups are very likely just by chance. So in other words, the randomization worked, and these two groups, or the control and the treatment groups, can be considered equal along all these different factors. And the difference between them is then only the question that they were posed. So in our case, we used a very simple type of treatment, which is called the direct treatment, meaning that the only thing that we varied was the question wording, and only in one simple way. So here's an example. The question posed to the treatment group would differ only in one key way from the question posed to the control group. The control group would see the question, are you going to the presentation on world government today? Whereas the treatment group would get the question, are you going to the presentation on world government at the YWF seminar today? So, and then if you observe in the treatment group a significantly higher proportion of people who say yes, then you know that that difference between the two groups is because these people are interested in going to the Young World Federalists webinar, not necessarily the presentation on world government. So I hope that makes sense. And here's the specific types of treatments or experimental conditions that we exposed respondents to. So in the unspecified version, people only got the phrase or got to state their support or opposition to the proposal of the establishment of a world government. Then in the democratic condition, that was specified as democratic in that people worldwide would be represented through free and fair elections or other ways of citizen participation. In the global issues conditions, we specified it that the world government would have the right and the power to deal with global issues like climate change, world poverty, and international peace, while national governments would maintain control over issues that are not global. And then the other, the final condition in most of the countries was the democratic and global issues condition, which was a combination of the former two. So democratic, in that people worldwide would be represented through free and fair elections or other ways of citizen participation. which should have the right and the power to deal with global issues like climate change, world poverty, and international peace, while national governments maintain control over non-global issues. And then in our last survey round, as I mentioned before, we added the coronavirus pandemic as a case in point. So one condition was purely based on COVID. A functional condition was a global government to deal with global issues like the coronavirus pandemic, while national governments maintain control over non-global issues. And the combined condition then was the democratic and COVID. So a democratic world government, free and fair elections, etc., to deal with global issues like the current pandemic, while national governments can retain control over non-global issues. Okay, and remember that each respondent, randomly allocated into the different groups, only got to see one of these proposals, right? So no respondent got to see two different ones and kind of compare them to each other. They thought this is what I'm supposed to evaluate. Okay, we had 4 survey rounds. Like I said, Markus and I started working on this in 2017 with a simple survey on Amazon Mechanical Turk on 500 non-representative respondents in the US. Then it became more sophisticated. 2018, we did a nationally representative survey in the UK, in Great Britain, technically, because it excluded Northern Ireland, with YouGov. Then we surveyed 6 countries in 2019 with data, nationwide samples with quotas and weights for region, age, and gender. Argentina, China, India, Russia, Spain, and US, each with a target of around 1,000. In Russia, we went over that. But then in the analyses, in the international weighted analyses and also in the population weighted analyses, we adjusted those sample sizes. So the sample sizes themselves are not too relevant because none of the analysis is based on these kind of random variations in sample size. And then in the final round in 2021, we partnered with Qualtrics, who drew on a couple of survey providers to provide samples that were representative along region, age, gender, and education. And as you can see, kind of from across the world, from Australia all the way to South America, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, East Asia, Eastern and Western Europe, North Africa. Okay, and this is the country coverage, just kind of visualized. And these are the different criteria that I talked about before that we are interested in terms of country variation, summarizing the different countries in how they compare these census. So from smaller to larger countries, average income, poor to wealthy, free, not free, partly free, and then weaker and stronger countries according to power scores. Good. Let's move to the results. And Esten, can you just tell me how much longer do we have?
Oh, I think you're doing great. I'm loving it. I think you shouldn't worry so much about the time. We have roughly, I think, an hour left for the entire webinar.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Then I'll take some time to discuss the results we have. I included actually all of the countries in the results, just in case it was of interest to anyone in the audience. And then I'll wrap up, kind of summarizing the patterns that we see. So the first slide, what it shows you is all of the countries in our sample, the response proportions by experimental conditions, and using equal weights. So weighting each country equally, independent of its population size. What you see here is that a slight majority of respondents opposes the unspecified version of a world government, right? So that specter of a world government. But then every other condition, democratic, global issues, COVID-19, democratic and global issues, democratic and COVID-19, receives a majority of support, starting with around 65% for COVID-19 and going to over 70% for the democratic and COVID-19 specification. And that's only the equal weights. Now look at the population weights. The population weights make it seem even more in support of, make the populations that we surveyed seem even more in support of of a world government. So here in this analysis, we weighted every country in our survey based on its population size. So in other words, of course, China and India were there as well, right? So they received quite a heavy weight based on their population of about 1.3 billion each. And because both of them were supportive, as you see in a minute, that obviously shifts this analysis quite significantly more in favor of world government. So as a result, what you see here is that even the unspecified version of a world government, remember that version just said the establishment of a world government with no further specification of how it would look at what it would do, how it would be designed. Even that specification receives nearly 60% of support on average across all countries. And then every other specification receives even more. So around 70% or up to 75% in the last specification. And then by country groups, again, distinguishing between equal weights and population weights, what we generally see is larger countries by population tend to be even more supportive of the idea of a world government. And this, by the way, is the fully specified version of a world government. So as democratic and functional. So larger populations, countries with larger populations tend to be more supportive. Countries with poorer countries tend to be more supportive. Citizens of less free countries tend to be more supportive. And along the power criterion, it's about even. But generally, it tends to be in all else equal analyses, it tends to be the weaker ones that are more supportive. And then similar patterns here for the population weights. And this plot shows you the treatment effects essentially. So remember that the main hypotheses that we had there was that the unspecified, the democratic specification and the global issues specifications, the functional specifications, would increase support compared to the unspecified version of a global government. And that's what you see here when you compare the first dot on the very left with its confidence interval to the others. So the fact that the confidence intervals don't overlap, but that they're separate, tells us that we can be very certain that the difference between these groups, in other words, the difference in support between people exposed to the unspecified condition versus the democratic condition, is not by chance. So that there is an actual difference in support for these different conditions or these different specifications of world government as we suspected. But then, of course, the story is a different one between the different conditions, between the different specifications of a world government. But that was not subject to our hypotheses. What we hypothesized about was the difference between the unspecified and the specified version. Okay, let's delve into the individual countries. There were 17 of them. I won't go into every bit of detail in every single country, but more try to show you kind of the typical picture in these 17 countries. And the most typical picture that we observed was very much like the one that we see here in Argentina and that you'll see in some of the other countries as well, that the majority of people or of respondents in our survey then weighted for nationally representative proportions along age, gender, education, and region. The majority opposes the unspecified version of a world government, but supports the specified versions as democratic, functional, or fully specified. And again, here on the right, you see the treatment effects. Again, the main thing is between the unspecified and the specified versions. And you can see here that there is, in fact, we can be highly confident that there is a statistically significant or an actual difference between between the unspecified version and the specified versions. So again, similar picture as in Argentina, as you can say, here in Australia, majority opposition to the idea of an unspecified world government, but majoritarian support for every other specification, including now in Australia, which was part of the 2021 round of surveys, the COVID-19 specifications. So most people in Australia were supportive of a democratic global government and or one focusing on global issues, including the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, the treatment effects.
Can I quickly ask about this treatment effect? What would it mean if the unspecified range or confidence interval did overlap? What is the counterfactual there? What would be the opposite? Help me understand.
That we cannot be sure that there is an actual difference between the average views in these two groups.
Okay.
That would be the counterfactual. So there is most likely a difference, right, between the two. And the confidence intervals always tell you, can we be sure that this observed difference is due to chance or not?
Okay. Okay. So basically, it's an accident or not. Basically, it is.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So if they did overlap, then we couldn't be sure. I mean, actually, it's not exactly just about the overlap. Ultimately, what matters is the p-value of the difference, which goes a bit too much into introductory statistics, I think. But roughly said, yeah, if there is an overlap, then we can't be sure that there is an actual difference in the underlying population.
So it could be other factors, basically. I guess would that be another way of phrasing it? That other factors would be by chance. It's something else. If they overlapped, it would maybe be a result of something else rather than these questions. Is that maybe like that they all?
No.
Okay.
If they overlap, it would mean that we cannot be sure that there is an actual difference in the underlying population. So if they overlap, in other words, if people liked or disliked an unspecified world government just as much as a democratic world government, then we wouldn't know that there is actually a difference between the two. People could like them equally well. Our data simply doesn't show if there is a difference in preference for the two versions, or simply put, people don't care.
I see. Okay, perfect. Thank you. It brings me back to my master's in political science. It's been a long time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, moving on to Canada. Again, same pattern: opposition to an unspecified world government versus support for any specification of world government. And then here's another widely reoccurring pattern. We see that in China and a couple of other countries that I'll show you in a minute. Here you actually see, and that's the reason, obviously, as I mentioned before, for the change between the equal weights and the population weights, looking across all countries. So in China, even the unspecified version of a world government receives majoritarian support. So you see that here. It is summing up to 54%, right, in total. So even the unspecified version, and then the specified versions get even more support. Colombia is again that similar pattern that we saw before in Argentina, Australia, etc. But then Egypt looks much more and even more extreme, like China again, right? So even the unspecified version gets more than three quarters of support among our respondents weighted for nationally representative distributions. France is again kind of that typical pattern that we saw before, majority opposition to the unspecified version, while the specified versions are supported by majorities. Hungary, same. India, though, again, note a democratic country, is in that same camp with China and Kenya, where even the unspecified version is supported by an overwhelming majority, and even more support for the specified versions. Indonesia, again, in that camp where strong support exists for all versions of a world government, even for an unspecified version. Kenya is again in that other camp of typical distributions, where a majority opposes the unspecified version, but every specified version is supported by a majority. Russia is a bit of an odd one. So the unspecified version and also the functional version are opposed by slight majorities, whereas the democratic version and the fully specified version are endorsed by majorities. South Korea is in the camp, again, a democracy, in the Eastern Hemisphere, is in the camp like China, Egypt, etc., where even the unspecified version is supported by majorities, and all other specified versions are even more so. Spain is in the same camp as the likes of Argentina, Australia, etc., that we saw, unspecified version, opposed by a majority, while all specified versions are supported by a majority. Turkey, the other camp of strong support for all versions of world government, but again, the factor that is the same across the board is that the specifications generally increase support. Even in those countries that are supportive across the board, the specifications tend to increase support, as you see again on the right side, where we visualize the treatment effects. And then the UK is an odd one out as well, a bit like Russia, where the unspecified version is quite strongly rejected by a majority, along with the democratic and the world poverty versions. But the climate change version and the final specification of democratic and global issues, including climate change, draws actually a strong majority of support of around 2/3. And then the absolute outlier in our sample was the United States, where no single world government specification received a majority of support. The unspecified version being rejected by around 2/3, almost 3/4, and every specification, democratic, functional, and full, being rejected by still a relatively clear majority of respondents. Interestingly enough, though, that also seems to hinge a lot on the wording that is used. In another paper in my PhD, in fact, I investigate support for a global democracy, very much operationalized along the same lines as we do in this paper, a directly elected global parliament and a global government focusing on transnational issues. And in that study, in 2 different survey rounds in the US, I observe majoritarian support in the United States. So in other words, just as an asterisk to that US result, it seems to depend a lot on the specific conceptualization and operationalization of the idea of a democratic global government. Okay, so that brings me to the conclusion. Majorities worldwide seem to oppose an unspecified world government, at least when we use equal weights in the analysis. But as you saw, not even when we use population weights. Standard specifications of a world government as democratic and or focused on global issues significantly increase support for a world government as we hypothesized it. Majorities worldwide, again, as we expected, support the standard proposal of a world government as specified as democratic and focused on global issues. And support tends to be stronger, even stronger, we should say, in more populous, less powerful, less free, and or less wealthy countries. And finally, on the individual country patterns that we just saw, you saw that 2 patterns are especially prevalent. One, the most prevalent one, is that the unspecified version is rejected, while the specified versions are supported. We saw that in Argentina, Australia, Canada, Colombia, France, Hungary, Kenya, and Spain. The other typical pattern is that actually all specifications are supported, but that The specified world government versions are even more supported than the unspecified one. That's what we saw in China, Egypt, India, Indonesia, South Korea, and Turkey. Russia and the UK were a bit odd in terms of majorities opposing the unspecified world government proposal, while support for the full specification drew a majority as well, but there was opposition to some specifications. And then the outlier in our study was the United States, where no global government specification received majoritarian public endorsement. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Wow. Thank you very much. It was very enlightening. I learned a lot. It's been a long time since I did my quantitative analysis courses, but I appreciated the really breaking it down. I'm sure other people in the audience did as well. How much you broke it down for us. For those of us that don't aren't actively in academia. Yeah, so I know there's probably some questions from the audience, but I wanted to I have a few maybe easy ones right off the top. I wanted to ask you about the limitations potentially on your research, particularly regarding the data collection or anything like that. If there's any yeah, if you could just maybe quickly go over the key limitations you may have to maybe structure the debate a bit.
Well, I mean, I think probably the obvious one also that you may have in mind and that others may have in mind is that who are the people, right, that you surveyed. So this was online-based research, right? So the clearest kind of limitation is that it's only people who are signed up to these online panels of respondents with these companies that we collaborated with, YouGov, etc. So I guess you could suspect that limitation to an online panel brings certain biases with it, right? But I mean, I want to push back against that a little bit because I mean, we live in a time in which online polling is changing quite dramatically. The gold standard still in public opinion research is random sampling. So the traditional method would be random digit dialing, so randomly calling up numbers, asking people if they want to participate in a survey, and then they would say yes, and then you can survey them based on the assumption that that random sample that you get then reflects the underlying population. So that's the traditional method, and that's how people used to do it for decades and decades. In the late 90s, it was still worked quite well. By the early 2000s, we had gotten to the point that even companies like Pew and Gallup had decreased from response rates of around 30% to response rates of around 5 to 6%. So in other words, only 1 out of 20 people that they called accepted the invitation to participate in a survey. So the conclusion of that is that traditional methods aren't actually that good anymore in getting unbiased samples. We generally have an issue with survey sampling, no matter what method you use. And by now, online polling has become so standard that companies like YouGov are accepted with their weighting methods, etc., are accepted among those polling firms that make predictions for things such as elections, etc. Right? So the bottom line simply is that online polling isn't actually that much worse, arguably, than traditional methods based on random digit dialing, etc. And in fact, it has quite a few advantages as well, right? One obvious one is that in online research, you can expose people to exactly the same question, exactly the same treatment, whereas in traditional methods, there's always this issue of the interviewer bias, right? Mm-hmm. So the survey can develop differently based on who is asking the questions and how they're asking the questions, and that's an issue that you don't have with online research, right? And there's also research out there that's showing one recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, so a very, very good journal, showing that treatment effects observed in these online panels are very similar to the ones observed in population-based samples. So bottom line, there is obviously a difference between the samples that we drew and the samples that you would get in using traditional methods. Frankly, we chose it because of the much higher efficiency of this method. So in terms of numbers, you would need around $50 US to survey one person using traditional methods. You need about a tenth of that to survey one person using an online polling method. So that's the level of efficiency that we're talking, meaning that instead of 17 countries, we would have only 1 or 2 countries, right? So that's a major kind of practical consideration.
Excellent.
And we don't have much reason to believe that the difference in terms of people on online panels versus not has any significant impact on the results that we observe.
Okay, thank you. I find the takeaway with these like sort of two general camps that some countries don't necessarily care so much about the specifications really interesting, and others really care. And then of course the sort of the Russia and UK example where they really need that to support it. It's super interesting. I guess the main takeaway for me is that we need to be very specific with our language.
Just to clarify, Essen, the point was not so much that they don't care. They actually do care, and we see that in the difference between support for the specified versus the unspecified versions. The main point was that in some of the countries, even the unspecified version gets a majority of support. While the support is even stronger for the specified.
When they do have, that's
so
right.
They do actually care. That's the one thing that we observe everywhere. People do care about the specification, but in some countries, it's even the unspecified version that gets it.
It is hard. It's almost hard to believe. Especially being an advocate for this idea. It's you run into people that basically push back all the time. So it's really interesting results. I'd be curious a little bit about your personal interest in this and your sort of your journey as a academic and why you chose to study this. But I don't want to take too much time on my own. So I will turn the floor over to some of the people that have raised their hands. I can see that my lovely colleague Luca Alfieri has shared his login link with his friends, and so they've all come in under his name. I've given them numbers. So the first person that I see in my row is Luca Alfieri, number 1. I don't know your real name, but your hand is raised, and if you can see that, please ask your question now.
So I see Rebecca just asked a question on the.
Sorry, you were talking about me, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out how to change my name from the very beginning. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
No, so as you're going to the presentation, there were bells ringing in my head of remembering how world leaders are currently talking about the system of world governance. Typically, they use the word order at some point in the conversation. The Americans might like to say or think that they have an upper hand in the world order. Certainly, many countries consider that it's a US dollar world, etc. And Putin, in starting the ground invasion in Ukraine, was leading with the talking point that he wants to break apart a unipolar world order and create something which is more East-West bloc or otherwise. So have you thought, Farsan, to do a survey where world governance was led by an influence of or EU or UN or US or BRICS or whatever polling party it might be that would be the main influence in that?
Have I thought about doing a survey like that?
Or maybe amalgamating some other data that has been done on that and putting it together with this, perhaps taking politics out of it gives a very different skew in the results.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a good idea. It's a new idea. Happy to pursue it at some point. So thanks a lot for the inspiration. I think it definitely. I mean, implicitly, what I see in comments a lot so these surveys, usually we include an open comment section as well, and people can elaborate on their thoughts and on their positions about world government, global democracy, etc. And it is a thought that features often in these open comments, right? So people include comments that, well, it would certainly be dominated by the strong powers already, or it would be dominated specifically by the US, etc. Or how would someone like Putin or Xi Jinping, etc., even be willing to subject themselves to such an institution, etc. So it's world politics at that level is definitely something on people's minds. But we didn't, in this survey, or I don't have a project going on right now, in which you would specify, that a world government would be dominated, or the global order would be dominated by a specific country or a specific power or actor. But it would certainly be interesting to do. Thanks for the inspiration, Luca.
Luca, yes. Perfect. Okay, and that it's a little bit relevant to the question Rebecca asked about sort of cross-referencing this data with things like the Global Peace Index to see if there would be a correlation between the country's level of peacefulness and the support for specified or unspecified. So it's a somewhat similar task of sort of cross-referencing this data with other factors. I don't know if your answer would be any different relevant to peacefulness.
Yeah, just note that, I mean, it is absolutely interesting. The question is, I mean, Rebecca, unfortunately, she left. She had to leave, right? So, but the question there is, what is the underlying hypothesis, right? So why would we expect that a country's peacefulness / a government's peacefulness would be associated with people's own citizens' views on this, right? And also the thing to bear in mind with these sorts of analyses is that they're ultimately correlational, not causation. So in other words, all that you can establish is that some factor, for example, peacefulness, is significantly associated, or not, with another factor, such as support or opposition to world government. But you can't say that association is actually due to peacefulness. All you see is a correlation. Whereas with something like what we did in the survey experiment, we can actually establish that the difference that we observe between the control group and the treatment group, or the unspecified version versus the specified versions, that difference is really due to that specification, is due to the fact that a world government is specified as democratic or as functionally focused, or both. And the reason we can do that is that all other factors are equal, as you saw in that overview table. People in these two groups are equal on average. The only thing that differs is the specification that they saw. And you can say that for an analysis like the one that Rebecca suggested, or like the ones that we did on country level variables. All that we can say there is that there is an association, and we have reasons to believe that it might be because of that factor, but we can't establish that for sure.
Interesting. Thank you. And this is recorded, so hopefully maybe Rebecca will get her answer someday in the future. Okay, so the next person is, of course, Tad Daly. Tad.
Thank you, Eston. First of all, good morning to everyone. Joined at 8 a.m. Here in Los Angeles. Second of all, Farsan, nice to meet you. I've certainly heard your name and heard about this research for several years, but I don't think I've ever met you in person. So it's very nice to meet you and to hear your very coherent presentation. Third, like my friend Eston, it's been even longer for me since I have a PhD, Farsan, in public policy analysis from the Rand Graduate School out here in Los Angeles. And it's been a long time since I've taken those courses in, I guess it's called survey research methodology. But I remember taking those courses, and it seems like you're doing it right. I mean, it brought back some of that stuff. I mean, this is clearly rigorous and serious methodologically. So with all those preambles, Farsan, there's something that I feel like is not being said. And I don't mean that in any kind of a disparaging way, but let me tell you what my concern is. You know, I've been involved with Citizens for Global Solutions and the World Federalist movement, and with this idea for a long time, since I was the student division chair of CGS, not wholly unlike what Eston is. It's not an idea that many people talk about outside our small circles. Let me just give a very specific example from my own country. I'm thinking out loud about this, and not so much talking about the results in the United States, but let's imagine a football stadium, you know, the fake football we play here, not the real football you all play in the rest of the world, you know, with nearly 100,000 people in it. And we're going to ask everyone, what do you think of an assault weapons ban? What do you think of climate change? Do you think climate change is real, and should government do something about it? Third example, what do you think of Obamacare? If you don't know, that's our very feeble public health initiative that tried to diminish the wholesale privatization of healthcare in this country about a dozen years ago. On all three of those, most of the people in that football stadium, they've thought about those issues. You know, they give an opinion on an assault weapons ban, on climate change being real versus a hoax, on whether Obamacare is a good thing or a bad thing for the healthcare system in the United States. But then if I ask them the fourth question, what do you think about a world government, either unspecified or the specified versions that you have talked about? Most of them would scratch their heads. You know, what does that mean? I've never really heard that term even. I've never really thought about it. And that's a big distinction, I think, Farsan, between issues that are really, in my country, and the same is true in other countries with different issues, that are really part of the contemporary public policy debate, and one like the establishment of a hypothetical future world government, which just isn't part of the public conversation. And the final example I'll give on this, and then I'll shut up, is I've worked in politics quite a bit. I've worked on Capitol Hill, I guess, for 3 different members of the House and 2 members of the US Senate. If I was wrong about this assertion I'm putting forward, world government would be talked about in the halls of the United States Congress. Assault weapons ban is, climate change is, Obamacare is. Those things are talked about on the floor of the House and the Senate all the time. World government has not been talked about in the legislature of my country since 1949 in any kind of a serious way, when my great mentor, U.S. Senator Alan Cranston, as head of the United World Federalists, really made hearings happen, and they had actually public hearings about the establishment of a hypothetical future world government. That kind of conversation is conspicuous wholly by its absence now. And so that's why, and I've been more long-winded than I intended to be, and I apologize, but that's why when I get an email and the headline is majorities worldwide support world government, it just rings so untrue. Again, I don't mean it disparagingly, but it's so contradictory to my own experience of trying to talk about this issue for so many years with people who've never heard us talk about it outside our tiny circles. I hope that was somewhat coherent, and thank you for letting me get this on the table.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, I mean, I agree with much of what you said, Ted. I think the difference there is you are touching on the subject of issue salience, not latent support. So in fact, in my thesis on global democracy that I'm now working on for kind of a standalone book, I also asked the question, how much have you thought about, or have you thought about this before?
Good.
To what extent? And my hypothesis going into that was that people haven't thought about this, as you just outlined eloquently right? That most people have never thought about this issue because it's not an issue that is salient as it used to be after World War II, when it really was a mass movement. And the outcome of that question, the results, and you can read up on that in my thesis, was that among the 5 countries that I surveyed, Brazil, Germany, Japan, the UK, and the US, in 4 of these countries, majorities indeed said they'd never thought about this issue before. And then, some proportion said, thought about it a bit, thought about it more than a bit, thought about it a lot. The only country among those 5 where a majority said that they've thought about it at least a bit was Brazil. So in the US, in Germany, in the UK, in Japan, majority said they'd never thought about the issue before the survey. But then the question is, do you have to have thought about an issue at least a bit to have formed an opinion on it, right? Or can you form an opinion ad hoc when you're exposed to it? And what we then tried to do in the survey is we tried to condense the concept into kind of the key ingredients, really boil it down to what is the main question here, what do we want an opinion on? And then, but then we also gave people the option to opt out, to say I don't know, or to not answer the question. And interestingly, that option was used by a disproportionately large number of people in the UK and the US. My suspicion, honestly, is that it's not necessarily a sign of them still not having formed an opinion, because in all other countries, we saw people not using the don't know option or the option to opt out of the question. They stated an opinion, and that's the results that we showed you. But in the UK and the US, we had quite a few people opting out of that question, not answering it. And I think there's a sort of what's going on there, and that's subject of kind of ongoing analysis. But I think what's going on there is this kind of societal taboo to talk about such questions for whatever reason. I mean, historically grounded, potentially, maybe in the Cold War, etc. But I mean, long story short, I think the issue that you were mentioning is one of issue salience, and we're not claiming here, we're not arguing that world government is something on top of people's minds all the time. It certainly isn't. It's in many cases, although we didn't ask that question in these surveys, but it would, based on my other survey on global democracy, in most cases it's something that people have probably thought about for the first time intensively through our survey. But I don't think that as a result of that you can say that the summary statement about their preference is not real. I think they think about it in that survey. They make up their mind on the spot, and they state their view. And in many cases, it's only a slight tendency toward, as you saw in the slides, right? Many people are only slightly on the support side, but on the support side nevertheless. So I don't think our kind of views on that or suspicions about kind of the data underlying it are necessarily contradictory. I agree that most people likely
thanks a lot. Yeah, that's a very, very, very illuminating response. It makes me feel like I'm not crazy, having my own personal experiences. But it's also very encouraging that when you ask people about it and they say, gee, I've never thought about that, but as you explain it to me, I think I might be for that. That is indeed very encouraging for those of us who want to make the issue a good deal more salient and part of the public policy debate.
Yeah, and then obviously the second point, sorry, just briefly, that I wanted to make is that both Eston and you kind of stated, whenever you talk to people about it, you get a certain kind of response, often skeptical, often opposing. I mean, Ted, you just gave it away that you're in LA. So, I suspect many people that you interact with about this are Americans, or kind of at least in American society. Eston, I suspect the same is the case with you.
I'm in Berlin.
Sorry, you're in Berlin, but from the US originally?
Yeah.
Right. So as you saw, the US is an outlier in terms of public opinion on this, right? So based on our data, there is about a 50-50 chance or even more to encounter someone who is opposed to the idea, even if just exposed to it the first time. Plus that unknown bit of people who opt out of the question. So the US or Americans or people in American society are an outlier case. And likely when you talk to people elsewhere, the response would be.
My country and Eston's home country are outliers in many ways, as in many other areas around the world.
Yeah, American
Thank you so
exceptionalism,
much,
but for
Farsan.
all the wrong reasons.
Exactly.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tad. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree that it's basically, yeah, well, it shows that it's not very salient. It's it's our job to basically make it salient. And this, if anything, yeah, is exactly what you said, Tad, that it should inspire us and show that it's maybe an easier task to make this idea salient than we previously thought. And we shouldn't, yeah, so that's maybe the key takeaway for advocates of the idea, at least in countries, in the countries outside the US, I guess. And now I'll move on to the next hand that's raised. This is the real and one and only Luca Alfieri.
Yes, thank you. So I have just two short questions. The first one is about if you get also, I mean, if you asked to the people in the online survey where they are located, for example. Not necessarily cities, but at least, I don't know, regions or whatever. Because one possibility is also that the people that are responding to the interviews, they are, I mean, for example, Turkey. The people that answer from Turkey, they are from Izmir and Istanbul, for example. So, I mean, maybe you asked for the location, I don't know, but if you don't, maybe this is a future research, because it would be interesting, for example, also to see some intranational geographic differences, for example. My second question is also a little bit personal, if you want, because I'm in academia too. So I wonder, what do you think about the fact that there are not so many people in academia that are advocate, I mean, at least if not advocating, talk about the issue, let's say. I mean, as we mentioned before, of course, there are some scholars here and there, but we cannot really say that even, I'm not even saying, let's say, the idea, but the conversation of it is mainstream. It is not. And I found this very uncomfortable, let's put it this way, because you know, I went in many conferences, I attended many seminars. I know people are aware of certain situations, and for me, saying that they are not even talk about it is very disturbing in a way, because you don't know if it is because just they don't believe in it, or because they, you know, they have the incentives not talk about it. Let's put it this way, and I will shut up.
Okay, so sorry, do we want to have David ask his question?
Yeah, if you want to collect them, then we can do that. Yeah.
Up to you. I mean, I've been noticing people dropping out, so I just want to make sure that we.
Yes. Let's take Luca first. Let's take Luca's questions, and then we'll go to David.
Yeah. Okay. So Luca, about your first question, it's not just people in Izmir and Istanbul that we asked. So the quotas that we use in every single country were nationally representative based on region, age, gender, and education. So we specified, for example, in Turkey, that it should be the national proportion of people in this part of Turkey, in that part of Turkey, in this part of Turkey, in that part of Turkey. And then the survey company sent out invitations to fill those quotas. And once we gathered all the data, so 1,500 up to 3,000 per country, or 3,100 upward in some countries, we re-weighted the data as well. So to make sure that the resulting sample actually reflected the population in terms of age groups, gender, education, and region. So just to clarify that there is no kind of urban bias, so to speak, in our data. About the other point of an international comparison, I think that's exactly what we're trying to do here, right? I mean, part of what the paper does is to show what patterns are observed across countries.
But the idea was also that if you ask also, the point is that, okay, they give you the sample, But in the question, did you ask also where they are located? Because if you know where the people that answer they are located, you can also make a map that is not only national based, but I don't know, NUTS 2, NUTS 3, whatever kind of subdivision you want. That would be interesting, I think, to check, you know.
Yeah, we have so we have data. We ask in every single country, where do you live, based on the equivalent of NUTS 1, I believe it is. So to give an idea, for example, in the US, we based it on states, or Canada also, Quebec, Ontario would be the units that we sampled in. So yeah, so technically you can do that, and the data is out there as well, by the way. Right, it's published along and with the replication data of our study. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, you know, the data's out there, and it can be done, and certainly something for future consideration. The second thing about academia, I mean, I agree. It's not mainstream, as it certainly as it used to be, as we just discussed with Ted. It's a shame that it isn't, but it's also an opportunity for us, because there's a lot of unexplored. There are a lot of unexplored questions, right? Especially on the empirical end, that I find fascinating. I think, you know, in terms of normative theory, there's still a lot out there, also in recent decades. But on the empirical side, we still have a lot to study and discover. I mean, I'm not sure about the. I mean, I personally, we present this paper at. We've presented this paper at several conferences, workshops, etc. The feedback has been constructive. I think also, I mean, in terms of this paper, what we're showing is that you know, there is actually underlying large-scale support around the world. So that itself is already a bit of a that counters maybe the suspicion of some who would want to couch their personal opposition in terms, you know, that are broader, that go beyond themselves. So. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I just want to encourage you, I guess, to you know, pursue these kinds of ideas you know, and present them as well. You know, for the most part, I think academia is a very open space, including for conversations like this that have been maybe under the radar for many decades. But I don't think that should discourage us from pursuing these ideas.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, and I think our final question potentially would be Mr. David Gallo.
Yeah, we had one more actually
in the chat. If you'd like to take that,
yeah, from
relevant, yes.
Well, but
yeah.
But I think, I mean, since David has been waiting for a while, and
yes,
he's also still on the chat, let's take that first. But I just wanted to make sure that we.
Yes, we got that. Okay, so two more. First David, and then from the chat. Yeah.
So this is more of a plea than it is a question, because I've dealt with so many people in the who are academics or journalists who write about world government, and maybe you're familiar with Gary Davis, who wrote his memoir, My Country is the World, also a book, World Government Ready or Not, saying we are ready for world government. Anyway, if you're writing a book, which you said you are, please reach out to me if you happen to mention Gary Davis and who he was and what he did and his life and what it all meant. Because I mean, I see so many errors, not just in the spelling of his name, which is with 2 R's. He always said, you know, I don't care what you say about me as long as you spell my name right. But anyway, please reach out to me. I'm very easy to find at World Service Authority, or the World Citizen Government that Gary Davis founded in 1953. Please ask questions and don't just make things up. That's really my plea. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you for the very committed plea. I love. Yeah, no, it's important. There is.
It is. Get it right. We need to get it right, and you're not going to get it right if you just see what's in the news already by journalists who didn't take the time to call us. And I worked with Gary Davis for almost 25 years. I've been at this organization for 33 years. So I feel like I'm an expert in this, in the idea of world citizen government, and of course of Gary Davis's legacy. So that's why. Thank you. Farsan, I appreciate it. But I do really appreciate your research. It really backs up, as Esad and Tad and everybody else was saying, all the work that we've been doing for much of our lives. So I appreciate so much your work. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, David. Speaking about names, I just want to say sorry for earlier. I think because on the chat it said Luca Alfieri for a couple of the windows, a couple of the callers. So apologies to the other not Luca Alfieri for addressing it as Luca Alfieri if I did. And also, David, about your name, I was wondering if there's any relation to the famous polling gallop.
No, if I were, I'd be on a beach in Tahiti or something. I wouldn't be a lowly human rights lawyer, not getting paid too well, promoting world citizen government. Not at all. Yeah, but thanks for asking.
Man, that's so. I'm just only going to jokes about how his great grandfather was a horse or something like that.
That's spelled with an OP though. So.
Oh, well, there you go. I'm not an academic. Okay, so I think that there's this final question. Thank you very much, David. And I would reiterate what David's saying, that there's not, I'm relatively new to the whole thing, but there's a wide a lot of knowledge on these topics within the movement, and people that maybe less empirical, like survey-based knowledge, but anything in terms of like ideas or different formulations, different specifications of the idea. There's a lot of sort of normative theorists who have also quite a bit of experience advocating for these causes, and might have good ideas on how to formulate certain questions, because we're always constantly running up with different counter arguments. So at least myself, I have many different ways of arguing the same sort of idea, which could be relevant in terms of drafting a global survey. So then, and I'm just one in a movement. So the question here from Nimat, I would just add a little bit of context that she, if I'm not mistaken on the gender there, but that person is from the Federal Forum, and that we did our previous webinar was with them, and they are based in Israel and Palestine, and so they basically advocate for federalism in that region of the world, and to a federal solution for that conflict, which is sort of the context to her question, or to that person's question. But if you'd like to take it now, please.
Yeah, happy to. So basically what I just wanted to say is that I don't think the claim is quite right. I mean, we did have several questions in our survey that are kind of conflict affected as well, right? I mean, we obviously had China in the survey, which has issues. I mean, conflict, kind of internal, at least internal conflict-related issues, or external as well, depending on how you define it, right? Taiwan and Hong Kong come to mind. Xinjiang province comes to mind. Tibet. Then Egypt, obviously, with kind of recent uprisings. Civil society conflict, Colombia with a long history, a recent history of internal conflict. We have India, which with China is engaged in conflict, border conflict. Not as hot, obviously, but then Russia is in there as well with recent episodes of conflict, and of course the United States with several ongoing conflicts. Turkey, border conflicts. So I just don't think the claim that we didn't have conflict affected countries in there. Maybe not a conflict into kind of full range civil war or full scale international conflict at the time of the study. But I don't think the assertion there was quite right. And then of course, but then the question is, and the underlying assumption in that question that Nimat asked is, to what extent does that affect public attitudes toward the idea of a global government? And that's kind of very much in line with what Rebecca was asking earlier as well, right? So I take that on board as something to study as well. And of course, again, as I said to Luca as well, the data is out there, right? I mean, the paper is published, the replication data is out there. So you can go in there and do these kind of correlational analysis yourself and explore to what extent the peace index is associated with public attitudes, or the or ongoing conflicts are associated with them or not.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I don't personally think I'll be jumping into this data anytime soon. I wait for experts such as yourself to do the hard work for me. But yes, it's obviously it's true what you say, that others can take it forward. I find it quite interesting because a lot of the sort of this functional based argument another way of talking about it is like ministry by ministry or something, or topic by topic building of a world federation. You saw that a little bit in the UK with how climate change was a huge factor that played a role there in their support for that. And so in some countries, it's based on when you connect the idea to a specific topic or potential future world ministry or whatever, you get more support. So the functionalism argument. And so I think that studies in that direction that focus on peace and war and peace, and how a potential world government might address that, or climate change, may help us as a movement to sort of narrow down our efforts, because I know that, you know, just the Young World Federalists, we have campaigns for all these, you know, climate change and war and peace, and we try to tackle all of these at once. The World Federalist movement has campaigns for environmental governance as well as war and peace, which are both important things. And then you have human rights and equality and poverty and all these. There's tons of issues. But if we were able to have some sort of empirical guidance on which are the issues that matter most, to help make the issue salient, that would be obviously highly beneficial to us as advocates. Yeah, so thank you very much. If there's anything else you'd like to add, maybe when can we expect your book? When's that coming out? Can I pre-order it?
No, not yet. And I don't want to settle on a date yet. But it's, you know, it's in the works, and you'll certainly hear about it, you know, through the obvious channels. I'll definitely advertise it through the World Federalist Movement's newsletter, mailing list. So I'm sure you know, you're
Sorry, Farsan, your forthcoming book is exclusively about this topic, public opinion research about world government?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, on the idea of a global democracy, so framed differently.
Right.
But it is exactly, it's building on my thesis, which was about you know, public opinion on the idea of a global democracy. And
excuse me, this was your PhD dissertation, and now you're making it into a book?
Exactly.
Got it.
That was my PhD in Oxford, and I've since the 5-country survey that I told you about, that we talked about, Ted, Brazil, Germany, Japan, UK, and US, and I've broadened it with the same questions that I asked in my survey in a variety of different countries. Kind of some of the differences in that thesis and in the book building on it are that I also go into what could be the effects of political actors positioning themselves on this issue, or the effect of people's attitudes on this issue with regard to their political preferences. So in other words, what if parties, for example, take a stance on the issue of a global democracy? How does that affect public attitudes, including their voting intentions even? Or how does people's attitudes toward global democracy, deliberated well and prompted through a battery of questions, affect their voting intention? So the idea there is to see how consequential, and that is kind of very much along the lines of the questions that you asked, Ted, I think. How consequential are these preferences actually when it comes down to, you know, preferences that are as important arguably as people's voting intentions or preferences for national governments. And I cover a broad spectrum of, from democracies to autocracies. I go into comments as well, so not just kind of closed-ended questions, but also analyze open comment questions in which people are free to flesh out their thoughts. So yeah, so a lot more than what's possible to cover.
Yeah, great, good. Well, congratulations on getting the PhD and making it into a book.
Thank you very much.
Like why didn't I make this my PhD dissertation topic? This would have been a fascinating road.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, maybe when the book's out, then we'll bring have another webinar, and you can we can go do something similar then. I'd love that.
I'd love to.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, well then, thank you very much for your time this evening or this morning, and thank you to our audience and all the questions. I know some people have dropped out, but thank you for everyone who stayed, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Very nice. So nice to meet you, Farsan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.